I'm Mitchell Smith. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of the Follicular Lymphoma Foundation. And this is one of our webinar series, and we're going to talk today a bit about newer treatments that are in the works or recently approved in some places for follicular lymphoma. We'll go through some topics with our two panelists, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And please participate in the audience polls. They're anonymous. It's really just to give us some information about how to target this and other webinars. And that you can ask in the chat. Remember that the information discussions today are for information purposes only. They do not constitute medical advice. Please consult with your own healthcare team for your personal medical advice. And some of the questions I'll make more general. You can ask them in a personal way, but because of the general nature of the webinar, I may rephrase them in a different way. But listen, and we'll try to get to the ones that we can. So let's get started by our first poll. We're going to know our audience a little bit. So have you or your loved one been treated or planning to start soon with one of these prior treatments? And while that's up, and we'll give you a moment to read through and answer it, I'd like to introduce our two panelists. I'm really excited today to have two wonderful people here with me. Dr. Jeremy Abramson, who I'll let him introduce himself in a second, who's our medical expert, and Ken Carnes, a patient who's kind enough to share his story with us and his thoughts. So, Ken, maybe I'll start with you if you want to introduce yourself.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Hi, everyone. I was diagnosed with follicular lymphoma in 2017. As of today, I'm in full remission. It's been this way for 5 years, and I am absolutely thrilled to join Dr. Smith and Dr. Abramson here. So that I don't forget to say this, I'm so honored that you're here. The work that you do is really life-saving and life-changing for people. So thank you both. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Ken. And Dr. Abramson.
Well, it's an honor for me to be here with Ken and Mitch and all of you to talk about follicular lymphoma and the excitement in treatment advances today. I'm Jeremy Abramson. I direct the Lymphoma Center at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and I'm an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School.
Thanks, Jeremy. And he undersells himself. He's really one of the world-class experts in treating lymphoma in general, and really clinical investigations and new therapies. So let's see our audience. It's interesting, again, that no one really is had or about to have CAR T, so Ken will be our novel person there. Bispecific antibodies may be a little more accessible, and so 14% of people have been that. And BTK inhibitors, we'll mention a little bit, only one person, but half the people have had other treatments, and about 10% currently considering other options. 10% have not received any treatment, which is common in follicular lymphoma. So it's a mix, and I think that's what we'll see with follicular lymphoma is there are lots of treatment options, and there's no one path. Everyone's sort of their unique individual. So the second poll, we'd like to ask you how familiar you are with some of these new therapies, such as CAR T and bispecific antibodies. No right or wrong answer. And then we'll ask this again at the end to see if we've helped that understanding. So while that is running and you're answering that, I'm sure there's a wide range of knowledge in the audience today, and also geographically what's available to people. I'm assuming since you're on the FLF site that you know a little bit about what follicular lymphoma is. We do have basic knowledge sessions, including some of the latest treatment on our Your Support Hub, which is on our website, and you can go to that at any time. Also, we have an overview of FL, a webinar. We had a webinar on clinical trials. And remember, again, that geographically, you may or may not be have access to some of these treatments. In past patient surveys, we had heard that many people have not terribly well informed about CAR T and bispecifics in particular, and that they wanted more information. And that's sort of the genesis of today's seminar, webinar, is that we really want to talk a little bit more about those immunotherapies. So the second poll, I just looking to see, there we go. So there's again a range as expected, and some people very little or no knowledge, about a third of people, about half the people have some knowledge, and 20% of the people think that they have a pretty good knowledge. No one's an expert, which is good, because I don't think any one of us would put a 5 on there because things are changing so quickly. So to give a little background, we're going to put a slide up here that shows the complexity of treatments. And when we think about treatment in cancer in general, and follicular lymphoma in particular, we try to put treatments into different classes. And so the little boxes here, that's a lymphoma cell in the middle. And what you see is there's really quite a large number of boxes. So there are many ways to attack a lymphoma cell. And traditionally with cancer treatments, we tried to attack the lymphoma cell or the cancer cell from inside and on the surface or the side, inside chemistry. And so you can see, for instance, on the right side, there's a red box on acalabrutinib, ibrutinib, and zanubrutinib. Those are 3 drugs which hit an enzyme inside a B cell called a BTK. So these are BTK inhibitors, and zanubrutinib was recently approved, at least in the United States, in combination with immunotherapy for treatment of follicular lymphoma. If you go on the upper left, not with a red box, but there's immunotherapy, and in there is rituximab, what you might know as Rituxan or MabThera. That was now over a quarter of a century ago approved for follicular lymphoma, and it is an antibody that binds to the surface of a B cell, a lymphoma cell, and makes the cell kill it, and makes your body kill it, indicates that your body should kill it. Now you can enhance these, because one of the ways that rituximab works is to tell your immune system to kill the cell. And so we're going to talk about a lot today are treatments in the other 2 red boxes where the antibody has a second part, and those are called bispecific antibodies on the top, and there's listed 4 that are late stage development, actually approved or approved for follicular lymphoma in some places. And we'll talk about those. Those actually bring the B cell, the lymphoma cell, and a T cell close together. So your T cells will be more effective in killing. And the other way to do it is to take T cells and educate them, teach them, grow them in the lab outside. So we collect your T cells, put them in a lab and grow them, and insert a gene which now attacks the B cell directly. So now you have educated T cells called CAR T cells. And these are very exciting, and we put the 3 in that red box. And we're going to talk in general terms about these. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the specific differences within a class. But then you can see there's lots of other agents too, and we're not going to get time to talk about these in today, but maybe in the future we will do that. So the lessons are lots of classes of drugs. We're going to focus today on the immunotherapy ones, CAR T cells and bispecific antibodies, that are ways to make your body's T cells either better killers or bring them closer to the B cell to kill directly. And those are the things we're going to be talking about. So we can take the slide off now. Thanks. And Jeremy, maybe you can expand on that brief overview of how new therapies are changing the treatment landscape for follicular lymphoma. I didn't mention tazemetostat, EZH2 inhibitor, but what's your viewpoint of where we are? I know we'll have a little more time later, but a preliminary sense of where we are with these all these new options and how you might think about them.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. It's really remarkable to take a step back and see how far we've come in the treatment of follicular lymphoma today. It wasn't too long ago, and oh, my motion sensor turned my lights off. I apologize. I'll have to be more animated on the webinar. It isn't too long ago that we had the options for follicular lymphoma were chemotherapy, then more chemotherapy. And we've really made dramatic advances since then. Now, the majority of people with follicular lymphoma, if they need treatment, may get chemotherapy once during the course of their treatment lifetime. But after frontline chemotherapy combined with an antibody, we typically rely on these newer targeted therapies, many of which work simply by harnessing the power of our own immune system. So today, for example, for a patient with high tumor burden, advanced stage follicular lymphoma, I'll typically give chemoimmunotherapy as frontline treatment. But second line treatment, we largely do lenalidomide-based treatment and oral therapy combined with a monoclonal antibody. And then in the third line setting, which is really what you've been highlighting, we have these newer targeted immunotherapies, bispecific antibodies and CAR T cells. And where those aren't available or accessible, we have other options there as well, including this drug zanubrutinib combined with obinutuzumab or tazemetostat, the EZH2 inhibitor. So, and whichever one of those we don't use in the third line setting, we have available in the fourth line setting, fifth line setting, which of course is usually not needed for the majority of people. So today, typically chemotherapy is a niche treatment front line, and then we use these targeted therapies thereafter.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for mentioning lenalidomide, because that is a pretty effective drug as well, and is another way that sort of, in some ways, interacts with the immune system. Again, attacks the lymphoma cell, but also the immune system, especially when given with an antibody to CD20. So, and also thank you for highlighting all the options, and it's always a difficult discussion. Not difficult because it's just because there's so many options, and that's what makes it. There's no one path, and everyone is a little bit different. So speaking of that, and maybe you can take a moment, as you mentioned, you ended up with CAR T cells some number of years ago, and you've done great with that. But maybe a little bit about your process in getting to CAR T, and a little bit about your experience with CAR T, because I think people are interested in hearing it. It sounds so technologically involved and maybe risky when you hear the side effects. So maybe tell us a little bit about your experience.
Be happy to. Let's just say it was an adventure. There were things I did not know were to be done to humans that we did. But in hindsight, that's every day for the experts, and for us who are a little nervous, it comes across that way, but was really just ultimately an experience that was great. I started off typically with my local doctor here in Connecticut, who was great. He was a terrific doctor. We started off on the one that Dr. Abramson mentioned, chemo. Apparently my body had the tumors throughout the whole quadrant of the body, so I started right away. So apparently I was watching and waiting without knowing I was watching and waiting. And in hindsight, it becomes obvious that I had issues that I just thought were addressed to age or not letting myself stay in as good a shape as I typically was or whatever. But we did Rituxan and bendamustine for 6 months. From the very first treatment, it was a bit slow going, taking in the drugs, but I'll be darned, I had amazing reaction to it right from the start. And by the end of the 6 months, I was as clear as could be. The challenge was within about 4 months, it came back. And let's just say it was like a movie. It came back and it was pissed, pardon the language. But at that point, I had to reassess what I was doing, and decided to take a different course and went into Boston. Found another place that was doing some pretty amazing work, and they started me on another trial. It was a drug trial that was working on more tumor-based, and I did that for a good 6 months, and didn't have the effect that anybody wanted. And that's when I was offered CAR T. And I will just say, Dr. Smith, it wasn't that easy of a decision. They explain to you the risks, and you say, "Wow, that sounds pretty risky." And I don't know anything about drug trials, but the difference for me was that CAR T was an opportunity to finish the job, to get into treatment that fixes it and puts you in remission and potentially holds you in remission longer, rather than just going back to a regular treatment of chemo or something that was already out there. So discussions with my family, I asked for a reference, and I found a friend. He had gone through it before, and he was close by. We now talk pretty regularly, but he gave me some great advice. I did it, and couldn't be more happy. That was in July of 2019. I go back annually now for my checkups because it was still in trial, and I was there first week of August, and knocking on wood, all good. So that was my road, and I think I may have mentioned this to both of you doctors before. Follicular takes up far less space in my head than it did for quite some time, and so I'm thankful.
You know, there are so many pearls of wisdom in that for our patients and for us as physicians. I don't even know where to start, but I think, you know, that your path of getting a treatment that works, and unfortunately it came back quickly, and we know that that's often a sign that your disease is going to be a little more aggressive than otherwise. Your willingness to go into not only one but a second clinical trial, which I think is really wonderful. And we do have our last webinar was on clinical trials and talks a little bit more about that. And the decision process and the idea how you get opinions from your different doctors, people who've been through it, your family, and it is really a shared decision-making process. I think all of those are really key points, not only for CAR T, but just in general, how you approach it. And then the last thing is this idea that many patients have told us that the anxiety is concerned about coming back. And so your sense that I wanted something that, you know, really gives me the chance of having it not take space in my head. I think there's so many points in there that unfortunately we don't have time to delve into, but I just wanted to emphasize what I heard that really have resonated with our patient population over time. I don't know if you want to like emphasize any of those, but I'll give you a chance to do that.
I think you hit on it, though. To me, it was the you know, constantly thinking about it was something I needed to address. You know, it's really 24/7 in the back of your mind. And I know when it started, maybe like some of our members here on the webinar today, you're hungry for information, and you just don't know a lot, and you're looking and searching and talking, and then thinking about what can I do. And that was another big thing. So I think for me, it was two things. Frankly, it was I sure wanted to stop thinking about it. And I also wanted to have some control, so that I felt like, you know, if I did X, Y, Z, I might be in better shape. So those were the two things that were mostly on my mind.
Okay, thanks. Jeremy, tell me a little bit about, you know, the process of getting CAR T from a lab into approval through clinical trials, et cetera, and the same process obviously with bispecifics have gone through. So a little bit about the research process and how drugs eventually get approved in this space.
Yeah, well, suffice to say, it's extraordinarily rigorous to get a drug from a laboratory or an idea in the mind of a scientist or a clinician into people with full regulatory approval. So we typically start in the laboratory and show that a treatment can be effective in cancer cells in a dish, and then in mice and other animals. And then, of course, after all of that, an understanding of the potential side effects and effects on a body, whether it's a mouse or a rat or a monkey, we do what's called first in human studies, which are very small studies with small numbers of courageous patients who often who've had very heavily pretreated disease with few options remaining is where these drugs are often first tested in humans, primarily to assess safety. Once safety is established, then it goes into larger phase 1 studies. And once that safety profile is confirmed, we do efficacy trials to show that not only can something be safe and manageable, but it's also effective. That typically is a phase 2 trial initially, a large number of patients treated all with that drug in order to show that indeed follicular lymphoma responds to the treatment and that those responses can last. And then once that's done, we go into what's called typically a phase 3 trial oftentimes. And that's where a newer treatment is compared to an otherwise standard treatment. And once all of this is done, and usually at once hundreds to thousands of patients are studied with efficacy and safely established, does a drug finally get regulatory approval? That's different country by country. So a drug might initially be approved in the European Union or the United States and then expand to other countries. And that can be a gradual process. So it's critically important to engage in the clinical trial process. It's a way to get access to newer, highly effective drugs before they reach approval. It's also a way we stand on the shoulders of all those who come before us and receive these newer treatments that have transformed the landscape for follicular lymphoma.
Great. That is a great, about the best concise description of that process that I can think of. So thank you very much for that. Very educational for our webinar participants. So thanks. And when you sign probably a 20-page consent form when you enter a trial, it's got all the gory details of all the things that can go wrong and can happen. How did that feel to you, and what was your experience relative to all the things that could happen versus what did happen?
Well, I consider it a benefit now, but at that point, you have to take your life into stock and say, am I ready to potentially be the one who doesn't make it? Not to be grueling, but your other choice is to suffer with it, and who knows what's going to happen there. But I will say it was also an awakening for me, because when, I'm just a person on the street, I have no medical background. When you think about a drug trial, you think about, treatments that my eye could pop out and grow a third arm. And that's really not what we're talking about. We're talking about a lot of work that's happened before. And I had a terrific doctor. I've had terrific doctors at every step of the way who were able to explain it in a way that gives you confidence that this is a worthwhile effort. And then you as the patient have to decide, am I willing to give it a go? Is, 6 months or whatever the time period worth it, to give this my best try? And at minimum, someone might learn something out of it. And as you know, they ask you to do a whole bunch of things. You sign up for the trial, and then they say, well, would you be willing to share this? Would you be willing to do that? Can we add this one on? Can we add that one on? And I had already convinced myself that if you ask me, I'm doing it. I'm all in, take it, let's learn something and let's go. So it wasn't that hard either. You think about this big, heavy lift, and you're just going to be so burdened personally. And I have a great network of people in my family, so that was really, really important. But it made the decision a lot more easy, and frankly, wasn't ultimately as scary as that first presentation for what you're facing.
Yeah, I think,
Mitch,
go ahead, Jeremy.
It's striking when you get handed this large consent document. It's sort of overwhelming for me to even go through the informed consent document with my patients, because by definition, by regulation, it really has to be exhaustive. Every side effect that's ever been reported, many of them may not even have been related to the drug itself. They could have been related to underlying disease or other sources. And so it's important to stay back and recognize that the serious side effects to treatments like CAR T cells or bispecific antibodies are actually quite uncommon. And the majority of side effects, if they happen, are mild. And some of that can get lost in this sort of exhaustive list of potential side effects that could happen. I tell my patients, if I ask them to sign a consent form to cross the street, they'd never cross the street. You'd probably get across the street fine, but you could fall and hit your head. You could get hit by a bus. You get struck by lightning. A satellite could fall out of the sky. You could fall down a manhole. There are all sorts of things that could happen. Do they happen typically? No, they're rare. And so it's important to sort of take a step back and say, yeah, but what's likely to happen? Is it likely to severe? And how do I get through it? Because the side effects to these newer treatments like CAR T cells and bispecific antibodies, though they can sound overwhelming at first blush, are actually typically mild, predictable, easily managed, and usually at 100% reversible.
Okay, so Ken, what happened to you? You get your cells taken out, sit in the chair for a few hours, get your cells taken out, you go back. When you finally get the treatment and it goes in, tell us, like, how did it feel and what your next week or two was like?
Yeah. So I know there have been advancements in CAR T now with outpatient. I was not outpatient. I was in the hospital for 8 days. And when they came to do the injection, let's just say I had an audience. Every doctor that I had talked to and met came to watch the injection. And frankly, I had convinced myself that I was going to be the new Captain America. I just didn't have the shield and the mask. And it was, I don't know, it was inspiring. It took all of a few minutes to do the injection. And then there's a aroma of the injection. These things have an aroma to it. And anyway, it was just great to have everybody there to get the injection. And then you just kind of recover. There's no instant, morphing or no electrical shocks and lights that happen. And the next thing you know, I'm, built like whoever the actor is who does Captain America. You just kind of power through with great care for 24/7. It was it took it out of me for sure. But the effects were really consistent. By the end of 8 days, I felt like I was tired. You have to take other medicines that I think affect your things like that. But it was at that point I knew I was in the clear and I was going to go. I knew I was in good shape. It was inspiring to me when I look back on it. Even at the time, I felt extraordinarily lucky and appreciative for having what I was having, because I did see the road ahead, that I was not going to be, looking in the mirror every morning trying to figure out, how I can feel better.
Five years ago, it was all inpatient. We've learned a little bit how to control it, monitor, maybe outpatient. You don't go home and live at home 3 hours away, but maybe you can tell us a little process, what's happened and how it is to get a CAR T product today.
Yeah, so, as you heard from Ken, it is a process. The initial, after the decision is made to move forward with a CAR T cell, of which there are 3 fully FDA approved in the United States to treat relapse refractory follicular lymphoma in the 3rd line or later setting. Initially, the T cells are collected through a process called apheresis or leukapheresis, which basically means getting hooked up to a fancy machine. The blood goes through it, the cells are taken out, the rest of the blood goes back. You're left with plenty of your own lymphocytes. We don't take all of them. Those cells are then shipped off to the manufacturer of the CAR T cell, where those cells are purified and then genetically modified to express this special targeted receptor on their surface. So the patient's own T lymphocyte now has a very specific receptor to go after the B-cell lymphoma. They're effectively bionic T cells now, and they then get delivered back to the patient's treating site, hospital, clinic, etc. Now, at that time, it's usually 3 to 4 weeks after those cells were taken out. Most patients are just observed during that time, but if patients do need a treatment during that time, they can get a treatment to help control the disease. That's called a bridging therapy, serving as a bridge until those CAR T cells are available. And once those CAR T cells are ready, We do 3 days typically of chemotherapy. It's relatively low dose chemotherapy, and it's really designed primarily to suppress the immune system just enough so that the CAR T cells are not rejected when they're reinfused. Now, they're your own T cells. Why would they be rejected? Well, they're your own T cells, but with a slight modification. And even that slight receptor that's new on the surface can be recognized as foreign, and those cells can be rejected. And so to prevent that from happening, 3 days of what we call lymphodepleting chemotherapy are given to suppress the immune system. And then 1 to 2 days later, the CAR T cells are given back. Once those cells are given back, those cells go in, they recognize the lymphoma, and they start to grow and divide and get to work. These are living drugs. These are cells. And when T cells encounter their target that they're designed to go after, they proliferate and they get to work. They kick up their heels and they start killing cancer cells. Now, when that happens, the process of these lymphocytes growing and dividing is inflammation, the immune system getting to work. And that inflammatory process can secrete inflammatory chemicals called cytokines. And that leads to the primary side effect that we see called cytokine release syndrome, or CRS. And that's typically just fever. If left unchecked, it can start to impair organs or make people think funny and confused a little bit, like delirium. But that's typically short-term and rapidly reversible. We've got good drugs that reverse cytokine release syndrome very quickly. But for that reason, patients may be hospitalized, or if they're treated as an outpatient, be required to live near the treating center in order to address these side effects if needed, because they really are quite treatable and completely reversible. We just have to have the patient with us in order to do that. Other potential side effects, these neurologic side effects where people can get a little confused, word finding difficulty, excess sleepiness, again, from the inflammation that can get around the area of the brain. But that also is quite reversible, often with just some steroids. And then we look at blood counts. Those blood counts can be decreased, particularly after the chemotherapy that's given for CAR T cell treatment, and an increased risk for infection from suppressing the immune system. Again, all of this quite manageable. Typically, we keep people close to our treating center for about a month. After that, the short-term side effects, typically those risks are completely gone, and patients can go to wherever they live, but they continue to be monitored, not only for the underlying follicular lymphoma, but for the potential for low blood counts, for the potential for increased risk for infections, which may warrant protective antibiotics and follow up with their local physicians going forward.
Great, thanks. So let's switch gears for a second here from the CAR T to the other class that I mentioned earlier, which is bispecific antibodies, which in a way is another way to get your T cells to attack the lymphoma. So they do have some of these similar side effects. Jeremy, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how bispecific works in the setting and is given and administered, and then we can sort of sit and compare them with the CAR T a little bit.
Yeah, so it's sort of a fundamentally different way to effectively try to achieve the same goal, which is directly activating the T lymphocyte against the lymphoma cell. So whereas a CAR T cell, we directly transform the T cell into a CAR T cell. The bispecific antibody is an off-the-shelf drug. It doesn't require genetic engineering, taking cells out of the body, or anything like that. In many ways, it's easier in that regard. But the bispecific antibody is effectively a two-headed antibody. Part of the antibody binds the lymphoma itself, and that's similar to how rituximab or obinutuzumab act. But unlike rituximab and obinutuzumab, this antibody has a second binding site. And that second binding site directly binds the patient's healthy T lymphocyte. So think about this as an antibody that binds to the lymphoma cell, throws a lasso around the patient's T cell, brings it in for a little cytotoxic kiss, so that patient's T cell is directly brought in to attack the patient's own lymphoma cell. Again, the exact idea of a CAR T cell, but sort of with this with a binding approach as opposed to a direct genetic engineering approach. But by activating the T cell, we can see the same types of side effects, such as cytokine release syndrome. Although with the bispecific antibodies, the side effects tend to occur at a slightly lower rate, tend to be a bit less severe, but like with CAR T cells, rapidly reversible.
Great, thanks. So with that as a background, you know, there have been a number of questions in the chat already about how do you sequence things, where do they go, and also what is there still a role for chemotherapy? So let's talk a little bit about where you think the bispecific antibodies are. There's already a lot of trial data for giving it instead of chemotherapy. Where are you with that process, and what are your thoughts on bispecific antibodies replacing chemoimmunotherapy that's still the current standard in most of the world?
Yeah, so, you know, currently bispecific antibodies, there are a couple FDA approved in the United States. One is called mosunetuzumab, one is called epcoritamab. They're given slightly differently. One of these is given as a time-limited therapy for 8 to 17 cycles. The other is given continuously in the absence of progressive follicular lymphoma. And they're both generally very well tolerated drugs. They're available as a third line or later treatment. So I typically use them after chemoimmunotherapy and lenalidomide-based treatment. And they're approved exactly where CAR T cells are also FDA approved. So how do you choose between them? Well, in general, I'd say, you know, both classes of drugs, both CAR T cells and bispecific antibodies, put the majority of patients into a complete remission. That's the initial goal of these treatments, and it's achieved in the majority. Slightly higher with CAR T cells, but still the majority with either one. With both classes of drugs, those remissions can last a very long period of time. Potentially longer with CAR T cells, although it's a little too early to say. Is either one of these classes of drugs curative for follicular lymphoma? I sure hope so, but it's also a little too early to say. We need many more years. But what I can say with both of these drugs is after 1.5 to 2 years, the majority of patients still remain in a remission after their initial treatment. But with a disease like follicular lymphoma, we need many years of follow-up to really know. How do I choose? Bispecific antibodies are off the shelf, readily available, and they don't include the requirement for lymphodepleting chemotherapy as CAR T cells. And so in that sense, they're a little less immunosuppressive. They cause fewer low blood count complications, and the risk of things like cytokine release syndrome and neurologic side effects is a bit lower. So on average, I favor bispecific antibodies ahead of CAR T cells because I think they're just a little bit easier. Now, where would I consider a CAR T cell in third line instead of a bispecific antibody? Well, what about the story we heard from Ken? Somebody whose disease is really behaving very aggressively. That's where I would use a CAR T cell earlier. We have a lot of experience using CAR T cells, not only with follicular lymphoma, but with other more aggressive types of lymphomas, where we know that people can achieve very long-term remissions. So I will think about using earlier CAR T cells in more aggressively behaving follicular lymphoma. The other time I'll think about is if a patient looks at the different options and says, look, you know, bispecific antibodies is between 8 cycles or long-term, you know, therapy, potentially repeated doses. CAR T cells are a one-time treatment, a one and done. And that can be very appealing. So I always talk about the potential differences and think about them. But my typical approach, use a bispecific antibody, a little bit easier, a little less toxic, keep CAR T cells in my back pocket if needed for the future.
Great, very helpful. And so I think the other thing that people worry about sequence, so if you had a bispecific, that doesn't mean you cannot get a CAR T, and even vice versa.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the current CAR T targets a different target than the bispecifics that we currently have. So that's a key feature. So we have a number of questions in the chat about accessibility, costs, coverage by insurance. Ken, you know, you were on a clinical trial, so they probably said, we don't care about the cost, that you don't have to pay for it. Is that what happened?
Yeah, for the most part, yes. And so that's pretty great. But in some of the follow-up treatments, there were some things that my insurance company gave me a little bit of a hassle on, but nothing that has affected me to say, gosh darn it, I shouldn't have done this. And we're not talking about tens of thousands of dollars. So all good.
Yeah. So Jeremy, we are talking about tens of thousands of dollars and multiples of that for the real world cost of this. In the U.S., if you use it in an approved indication, is it generally covered by insurance, Medicare, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there can be great sticker shock to these drugs, and they're not affordable out of pocket, for sure. But these are fully, in the United States, fully FDA approved. And that means when given as they're approved as what we call on-label treatment, third line or later follicular lymphoma, for example, these are typically fully covered by both private insurers and by Medicare. And I will say, you know, when it, you know, as clinical trials are covered, that I think is where these drugs are going to move earlier, and it's the earlier treatment where we're going to get them right now on clinical trials. So I actually don't think bispecific antibodies are just going to sit in the third line or later setting. What I think is we're going to move them far earlier. And I'd be pretty surprised if 5 years from now, we're not giving bispecifics as a component of frontline therapy, either in combination with other targeted drugs or alone, or potentially with chemotherapy. But I think the writing's on the wall for chemotherapy and follicular lymphoma. And I think these highly active treatments, particularly bispecific antibodies, are so well tolerated, relatively easy to administer, that I think the future is moving these bispecific antibodies into the first and second line treatment and leaving CAR T cells for the third line or later treatment once these, if needed.
Yeah, I think that's really what we all hope will happen. And there's a lot of questions about that in the chat. And I think what we're looking at is, you know, my takeaway from the discussion is that you might want to look, if you haven't been treated at all, you might want to look for a clinical trial that involves a bispecific antibody rather than chemotherapy. For, you know, probably wouldn't cost you the money for that and might save you from chemotherapy, but only on a trial. It's not approved yet. And so this is a space where you can help the field and yourself at the same time. And again, even in other countries where they're not approved, you may find an international trial of a bispecific containing regimen first line. So right now you have to look at it on a trial, but again, those are benefits of that. So good discussion. I know that we want to leave some time, and I wanted to come back to you and you know, you've done so well. We talked earlier about your attitude, your mental approach, that it doesn't take space in your head. Can you expand on that a little bit about what you did? People always want to know, what can I do to keep it away? That sort of thing.
Yeah, that was my biggest thing. I kept every time I saw my doctor, I kept asking him, what did I do? What do I need to avoid? And he kept giving me the same answer back. So, you know, I realized that, you know, science was sure doing a pretty good job for me. So what do I do now? What's my role? You can't just keep doing what you're doing. You know, the old saying, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep getting what you're getting. So, and it's not that I was unhealthy, but what I decided was I was gonna really change my behaviors, including mentally, about just thinking more positively, more thankfully through the day, but also my diet and my exercise. And it just sounds so basic. I think we talked about it, but I put the pedal to the metal, had a great support system with my wife and family. And so now I'm a bit more conscious on my diet, not to say that I'm some prude that won't go out to dinner. And, you know, I love muffins and chocolate just like everybody else, but I exercise pretty aggressively now, but I had done that before and I'd kind of let that slip in midlife to some degree. So I've just taken those things and said, I'm going to keep doing this. This is my job now. This is what I'm doing to complement the science. And it's been great. It's not a burden. It's not a burden whatsoever. It's a minor change in a lifestyle that's been great for me.
Yeah, I think that echoes what we heard in our last webinar from our patient representative, who, you know, had a positive attitude, but the feeling that you can control things by doing the things that we know you need to do to stay healthy. It's not magic, but you just really have to do them. And so that's a message we want to sort of emphasize.
It's true.
I do want to leave a few minutes for some specific questions. So while we're doing that, can we put the last pull up, which is sort of to see if we've made any headway here and how familiar you are with the latest treatments. And while we have that up, I mean, I just want to. We talked a lot about moving some of these treatments earlier in treatment, but what do you think where are we in terms of personalizing treatment, finding out what drives follicular lymphoma in different patients, and are we going to be able to say this drug's for you and that drug's for this other person? Where are we headed on the horizon for that one?
Yeah, we're certainly making progress in that regard. We've learned a lot about the different genetic drivers, the different mutations that cause a normal B lymphocyte to become a follicular lymphoma cell. And it turns out it isn't the same for everybody. And it's not typically a single genetic mutation. It's typically multiple of them that combine to make a normal lymphocyte into follicular lymphoma. And so everybody's follicular lymphoma is a little bit different. And that means that we're not going to probably find a single molecular target for everybody with follicular lymphoma. Now, the treatments we've primarily talked about today go after proteins on the surface of every follicular lymphoma. So that is not personalized. Things like monoclonal antibodies, bispecific antibodies, and CAR T cells target ubiquitously expressed proteins on lymphoma cells. If we get into the intrinsic biology of the cell, we can get more targeted. Today, we do have a single drug that is approved based on a single intracellular protein target. That's the EZH2 inhibitor, tazemetostat. Tazemetostat targets EZH2, whether it's mutated or not, but the response rates are much higher if the EZH2 is mutated. And it's an extremely well-tolerated pill that has no IV infusions. So as of today, I do test patients, particularly with relapsed follicular lymphoma, for that mutation. It's with a broad mutational panel called next generation sequencing. And if I find an EZH2 mutation, then I might consider tazemetostat earlier in the course, even potentially before a CAR T cell, if a mutation is present, because those patients can respond very nicely and for a long time with very few, and some patients, zero side effects whatsoever. Beyond EZH2, we don't target any specific personalized proteins today, but that research is ongoing in the laboratory. Numerous targeted pills are under investigation. We heard about zanubrutinib earlier, the BTK inhibitor. That also is not directed at a mutated protein, but a protein in general. So I think ultimately personalizing is going to take a little bit more biology and effort. But today we personalize based on patient preferences and based on the disease characteristics. So some patients might favor a bispecific antibody approach. Some patients might favor a one and done CAR T cell approach. Some patients might favor a pill type approach with something like lenalidomide, zanubrutinib, or tazemetostat. So today it's a conversation between patients and doctors. It's shared decision making to think about what makes sense in a given situation.
Great, thanks. I do want to just call out the EZH2 inhibitor and zanubrutinib are not approved everywhere. So those are also ones that may not be approved in your location, but again, could be looked for on a clinical trial because there are still ongoing trials for those drugs. And it was more to highlight the future. The poll is up, and I'm gratified to see that we've definitely shifted towards the 3s and 4s. So thank you for that. Ken, I want to go back. We've talked all about these fancy new immunotherapies, but there's a bunch of stuff in here about why can't we get rid of chemotherapy first line? It's horrible, and why do we have to wait? Can you tell us a little bit about your bendamustine rituximab experience? Just maybe to let people know that it's not quite as terrible chemotherapy as other people think it is.
It was, it was not bad at all, Dr. Smith. It was close by the house. I had a lab there. It was just nice people. I had an immediate response after the first treatment. I don't know if this is personal, maybe it is, but I never had the upset stomachs or the vomiting, and I worked full time. and I had no issues. I worked it all with my doctor. I travel a bit. It did not impede any travel other than some international trips that had to be postponed. But I would have been really happy for that treatment to stay in remission after those 4 months. I feel like I would have been just as great right now as I am having done that. So I can see the difference. There's a big difference in the commitment all the way around, your time and all. So it's worthwhile. The other thing is, as a patient, I've met a whole bunch of folks who are in the same boat as me. You know, when you hang around these places with follicular patients, you meet them, and there's a whole bunch of folks that treatment works for, and they have blessings from the beginning. So I'm very happy with that. I've never thought, gosh, I wish I would have done it, you know, a year and a half before. It was the right way for me.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to emphasize the standard bendamustine rituximab is not a terrible treatment. It's outpatient. You can work, you can do things. So
yes,
we think we can do better and avoid some of the long-term effects, but it's not something you should be afraid of if that's your first-line treatment. There's an interesting new drug out there, Jeremy. There's a question here about golcadomide plus rituximab. This one looks like it might have to be a first-line treatment. So maybe you could expand on lenalidomide and golcadomide a little bit.
Yeah, so, golcadomide, whenever we have a good drug in medicine, whenever the old saying goes, if you have a mousetrap, the next goal is to build a better mousetrap, make better versions or better drugs to target effective targets. And golcadomide is sort of a newer version of lenalidomide, effectively. Its goal is it has multiple effects. We call it a cell modulator. Its goal is it has effects to both kill cancer cells directly and by enhancing the effect of the immune system. So initially, lenalidomide was shown to be very effective in relapsed follicular lymphoma. A large trial showed that it's actually very similar to chemotherapy in the frontline setting. Though it's not FDA approved for that reason, it does appear relatively equivalent to the effect seen from frontline chemotherapy. And what that has led to is the question to build a better mousetrap and use one of these cell mod type drugs, which is an oral drug in combination with an antibody in frontline. So that's where golcadomide is. It's effectively a more potent version of a drug like lenalidomide. And this is a very appealing trial. It's being investigated both in relapsed and in previously untreated follicular lymphoma as a potential chemotherapy-free approach in the frontline setting.
Great, thank you. Just looking at some of the other questions and see. I think, in the interest of time, we have a few minutes left, and I do want to spend a couple of minutes sort of with the thank yous and the wrap-ups. I mentioned the poll. And any last messages you think that our audience might be interested that you wanted to convey? Give you a chance for that.
Well, for those suffering, just keep going. Just keep doing what you're doing. Trust your doctors. Look at your options and keep going. You'll be all right. For those who are caring for people, thank you. Just help them through. They need the help.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I heard from you is, your interaction with your physicians and your ability to talk with them and learn and decide what's right for you. There's a lot of questions about how do doctors decide, what do you do right treatment, and is there a right one? And I think what I was hearing from you is that it really is the shared decision. You have to work and where you are with your lifestyle, what's available to you, and that there are so many options. There isn't one right one.
It's really true. And I've just had the good fortune of great doctors from Connecticut to Massachusetts that we sat and we talked about the options, and I went in eyes wide open of knowing exactly what was available for me and what it was going to take.
Jeremy, any last words from you?
Justice is an optimistic time, so Ken's optimism inspires me and should inspire us all. I think taking a step back, it's important to remember follicular lymphoma is still an indolent disease. The vast majority of people diagnosed today with follicular lymphoma will have a normal life expectancy. That is due to the indolent behavior, but also due to treatment advances that have improved that prognosis compared to prior eras and decades. So many patients don't need to be treated. If they do, just frontline treatment, even with bendamustine, may be the only treatment they ever need, or even low-dose radiation. And ultimately, it's thrilling to know that we do have these advanced immunotherapies, CAR T cells, bispecific antibodies, other treatment options available in the third line or later setting. But I think it's at a big picture view, most patients will never need those with follicular lymphoma. But boy, is it good to know that they're available if we do. And the treatments today continue to get better and better. Our approach to follicular lymphoma is going to continue to evolve. It'll be better 5 years from now, just like it's better today than it was 5 years ago. So it's an optimistic time, and I think Ken's example couldn't be greater.
Great, thank you. I think that's the message. Lots of options, optimism, things continuing to move, especially with the benefit of clinical trials. So we're right up to time. So I want to thank our panelists clearly for their wonderful insights. I want to thank you for attending. We thank the sponsors who are listed up here for their support of this program, without which we couldn't really put it on. We do have a webinar coming up in January, focused on emotional health and well-being, because we know that's important, both dealing with the disease and the treatment for you and if you're a patient and caregivers. In March, we'd like to do a topic of your choice. So we really are interested in hearing what you want to hear. And so we're open to suggestions, and we'll take a vote in the future.